Buenos días, tardes y noches a todos los que siguen este canal de Cristiano Moderno. Hoy la transmisión será en inglés. Ya he subido esto en otra ocasión en español. Pueden ir a buscar en el canal. Uh, en español ya estoy con una historia eclesiástica, tomo 4. Pero la comunidad de habla inglesa está tratada de prensa corriente y ellos están todavía en tomo primero, capítulo 7 de Eusebio de Cesarea, donde explica ciertas diferencias entre Mateo 1 y Lucas 3 sobre la genealogía de Jesús. Lo explica muy bien Eusebio de Cesarea, pero aunque ya subí esto en español, hoy le toca a los de habla inglesa. Disculpas a los de la comunidad hispana. En cuanto haya oportunidad, subiré abajo el enlace para los que lo quieran ver en español. Good evening, afternoon, or night. Today's transmission is in English, and it is a continuation of where we left off last week. Or the last time I uploaded anything. I took some time off because I got sick with the flu and I needed some time to recuperate, but I am back. El motivo por el cual me ausenté este tiempo de los canales es porque me enfermé con la gripa y necesité un tiempo para reponer mi salud y ya estoy de vuelta. Having said this, let's begin. Today we're going to continue with Eusebius of Caesarea and his work titled Ecclesiastical History. Eusebius of Caesarea is a very important person to study if we want to know about church history. He's a very early historian of the church. He lived between 274 and 337, if I remember correctly. So he lived during a very crucial time in the development of the history of the church. He lived through the persecutions of Diocletian. He lived through what is known as the crisis of the 3rd century. He lived through the time of Constantine. He lived during the time of the Council of Nicaea. He was there in the Council of Nicaea, so he is a very important witness to read about if we are interested in finding out about those events. There are so many people who, because they don't read, they go on with what other people say, even if it's very wrong. But anybody who studies church history knows that you look at the documents of primary sources and you put more credibility on primary sources and not, okay, you put more credibility on primary sources like witnesses, first-hand witnesses, and not as much on secondary witnesses like researchers that came in centuries later. Now, if you're talking about an event, who would you trust? Somebody who was present or somebody who heard gossip about an event? Obviously, the person who was there. Well, the Eusebius of Caesarea was there a very important moment in church history, and also afterwards, or I should say beforehand, the events that occurred before the time he existed, he goes straight to primary sources as well, those who were witnesses of the events. Now, today, though, we're going to see how Eusebius of Caesarea addresses a very important part of biblical study as well. You see, when we still study the Gospels and we look at the religious genealogy, we usually go with the genealogy of Matthew chapter 1. But as a lot of atheists have been quick to point out, Luke 3 presents a very, very different genealogy. Why? How come? Who is right? Well, that has always been a stickler for us. But what we need to identify is this. Matthew was a Jew writing for the Jews. Luke was a Gentile writing for Gentiles, and therefore that's where we get the difference between the two. You see, in Judaism, for us to understand what we're going to be reading about, because they talk marriage by law, marriage by nature, we need to understand a very important component here, and it is known as the levirate marriage, which we are going to look at right now. Excuse me for a moment while I look up for the. I had written, chosen in one of these. I had built up an example of what a levirate marriage is. Here we go. This is one based pretty much from what we can see in the gospel. You see, according to Jewish custom, if a person dies without having children, his brother or the next of kin had to marry the widow. And the purpose of this is so that the person who has died without children technically has a descendant, though it's not a real descendant to him according to the rest of us. According to Levirate marriage, he does. Let's look at this, where we see the gospel in the two different gospels, and Eusebius is going to further talk about that. Let's say you have a guy called Matat. He has two kids, Eli and Jacob. Jacob gets married, but unfortunately, Jacob dies and he has no children. Jacob dies without having any children. According to Jewish law, the widow has to get involved in what is known as the levirate marriage, which means that at this point, the widow, Jacob's widow, needs to marry her brother-in-law. In this case, her brother-in-law's name is called Eli. So Jacob's widow now has to marry his brother-in-law, Eli, and they end up having a son. His name is Jose. However, since this is the first son that the brother Eli and the widow have together, he is taken, according to levirate marriage, he is, okay, according to our concept of marriage, excuse me, Jose is Eli's son because Eli married the widow and they have together Jose. But according to levirate marriage, since it's the first son between Eli and the widow, this first son is not considered to be Eli's son, but he is placed as Jacob's son. Because the purpose of Eli marrying the widow is so that Jacob has a descendant, even though he has not had a child. This we find throughout the law of Moses. Now, let's jump right in. Okay, let's look at these two real quickly before we jump in, and let's look at real quickly at Matthew chapter 1. so that you know what I am talking about when I pointed out these two different genealogies. Matthew chapter 1, we're going to skip all the way down here to the birth of Jesus and just a generation before. Verses 15 and 16. Eliud, the father of Eleazar, Eleazar, the father of Matan, Matan, the father of Jacob, and Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. You see, it is Jesus, that right before Jesus is Joseph. Before Joseph, we have Jacob. Okay? And before Jacob, we have Matan. Now, we go and I don't know why I exited this. Let's continue sharing what we're looking at right now. And now let's look at Luke chapter 3. And we're going to skip all the way down to the actual genealogy. And it tells us here, now Jesus was himself about 3 years old when he began his ministry. He was the son of, so it was thought of Joseph, son of Eli, son of Matthat. So Luke tells us that the son of Matthat was Eli, and Matthew told us that he was Jacob. Who's right? Well, remember, the book of Luke was written by a Gentile for Gentiles. This is people who did not participate in levirate marriage. The book of Matthew was written by a Hebrew for Hebrews, people who engage in levirate marriage. That is the reason why they are so vastly different. And Eusebius of Caesarea jumps into this. So let's start reading what Eusebius of Caesarea in church history has to tell us about this. We find it in chapter in book 1, chapter 7. Let's see how far away we can get through today. Matthew, it says chapter 7, and the alleged discrepancy in the gospel in regard to the genealogy of Jesus of Christ. Matthew and Luke in their gospels have given us the genealogy of Christ differently, and many suppose that they are at variance with one another. In other words, a lot of people, especially atheists, try to use this against those of us who are people of faith. A lot of people who say, oh, there's a lot of contradictions in the Bible. As I explained before, the Bible has no contradictions. Even though these two genealogies appear to contradict each other, there is no contradiction. They are both based on different focuses of marriage, based on the different cultures they were writing for. One is for the Jews who understand levirate marriage. You see, Joseph's grandfather had two kids. One of them had no kids, so Joseph's father was the fruit of levirate marriage. Joseph's father was the son. Joseph was the son of Eli. But since Eli's brother Jacob had no children, Eli had to marry the widow, and from there Joseph was born. Since as a consequence, every believer in ignorance of the truth has been zealous to invent some explanation which harmonize the two passages, permit us to subjoin the account of the matter which has come down to us, and which is given by Africanus, who was mentioned to us just above in his epistle to Aristides. In other words, A lot of people have come with other different explanations as to why they're different. Some people, well, I'm not even going to go to the other types of explanations because they're really not worth the limited time we have for this video to look at. But Eusebius of Caesarea is going straight to the documents of Africanus, one of the fathers of the church, and Aristides in the discussion they had amongst themselves, where he addresses this very so-called contradiction. Now, where he discusses the harmony of the gospel genealogies. In other words, a lot of people see that these two genealogies are different, but Africanus points out that they are not different, that these two genealogies actually match up if you take closely into account what I just pointed out about different marriage. Let's see. After refuting the opinions of others as forced and deceptive, he gives the account which he can received from the tradition of these words. Now, a lot of people oppose the concept of tradition. Oh, this and that. Oh, traditions. Oh, this. Oh, blah, blah, blah. But we see here that no, apostolic tradition is necessary to better understand the Bible. You cannot reject tradition and say, oh, sola scriptura. Sola scriptura, brothers and sisters, is a lie. Nowhere in the Bible is sola scriptura backed up. It all needs to be explained through the eyes of apostolic tradition, because after all, apostolic tradition came before the Gospels. Luke chapter 1 tells us that he based himself on the apostolic tradition handed down to him to decide what he was going to write in the Gospel of Luke. Let me show real quick, though I am digressing, this digression is important. That's why I'm putting it out. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Luke chapter 1. Many have undertaken to draw up, okay, this is Luke chapter 1, verse 1, New International Version. Many have taken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those of whom were the first eyewitnesses and servants to the world. In other words, a lot of people have tried to write down what they have been handed down. In other words, a lot of people wrote down what the tradition, the apostolic tradition was. Luke is telling us that before there even was a gospel of Luke that he was writing, there was already a teaching of the church handed down by the apostles. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you. So he too decides to investigate. What does he investigate? Scripture? No, there was no scripture yet. Does he decide to investigate the gospel? No, he is writing the gospel. He investigates what the apostolic tradition is and then writes it down. So Luke is telling us that before there was the word of God, before there was a written, there was first a tradition, an apostolic tradition. And this apostolic tradition informed us of what was to be written down in the gospel. So sola scriptura, brothers and sisters, I hate to break it to you, it's a lie. It's actually not biblical doctrine. It actually goes against biblical doctrine. Now let's continue seeing what else they say. For whereas the names of the generations were reckoned in Israel either according to nature or according to law. According to nature refers to like the regular marriages, which we all know about, You get married to somebody, she gets pregnant by you, the child is your child. But then they're talking about marriage according to law. That's a levirate marriage. You marry your brother's widow, you get her pregnant. Okay, let's back up. Your brother, who is married, dies, but he has not had an opportunity to have a child with his wife. You then are required to marry the widow. You get the widow pregnant, and that child, that is the first child that you get her pregnant with, is not your child, even though you're the one who got her pregnant. Since your brother died childless, that first child belongs to your brother. That's the marriage by law, according to the Hebrew tradition, the levirate marriage. According to nature, by succession of legitimate offspring, in other words, those who you yourself um, get with the person you married. And according to the law, whenever another raised up a child in the name of a brother dying childless, as I just explained for you. For because a clear hope of resurrection was not yet given, Christ had not yet arrived, so the Jews did not have yet a concept of resurrection at the time when God gave this to law to Moses. They had a representation of the future promise by kind of mortal resurrection, in order that the name of that one deceased might be perpetuated. In other words, by you marrying your brother's widow and getting her pregnant with your seed, you were in a sense symbolically um, resurrecting your dead brother's seed. Whereas then some of those who were inserted in this genealogical table succeeded by natural descent, the son to the father, while others who were born of one father were ascribed by the name to another. Mention was made of both of those who were progenitors, in fact, of those who were so only by name. In other words, one of those talk about a natural descent. You got this woman pregnant, he is your child. The other one says only by name. The woman you married and got pregnant is your brother's widow. But since your brother died without having children, your first child with a widow is considered to be your brother's son, even though it is not his seed that impregnated her, but yours. Thus, neither of the Gospels is in error. For even though they're different, none of them is wrong. For one reckons by nature, this is the Gospel of Luke, which was written by a Gentile who do not practice levirate marriage. So they tell us directly who was a child of who. And the other, Matthew, written by Hebrew, where levirate marriage was a law. For the line of descent from Solomon and that of Nathan were so involved, the one with the other, by the raising up of children to the childless and by their second marriages, that the same persons are justly considered to belong at one time to one, at another time to another. In other words, if I were to trace this genealogy back to the beginning, one line tells us that um, the child came from King Solomon's line. And the other one tells us that Solomon had another brother, um, and that other brother died. Well, there's no specific. One of the two brothers, Solomon or Nathan, one of them two dies childless. So the brother marries the widow. That's why one genealogy tells us that Jesus is born out of Solomon. The other one tells us that he comes from the line of Nathan, because one is telling us the actual genealogy, the other one is telling the genealogy according to levirate marriage. Um, and both are correct. That because one of them is natural marriage, the other one is what would be correct according to levirate marriage. So that both of these accounts are strictly true and come down to Joseph with considerable intricacy indeed, yet quite accuracy. In other words, you notice I only went to the last four and I did not go too way to the beginning because it gets too involved when you're trying to compare which line is levirate, which line is natural. In order to that what I have said may be made clear, I shall explain interchange of generations. If we reckon that generations from David through Solomon, the third from the end found to be Matan, who begot Jacob, the father of Joseph. But with Luke, we reckon them from Nathan, the son of David, in manner the third from the end Melchi, whose son Eli was the father of Joseph, for Joseph was the son of Eli, the son of Melchi. In other words, we see here it's telling us the actual genealogy. Joseph's father was Eli, but Eli's brother died childless, so Joseph was, according to levirate marriage, Eli was considered the son of Jacob, who in reality would have been his uncle, but because of levirate marriage, he's considered his father. Joseph, therefore, being the object proposed to us, it must be shown how it is that each is recorded to be his father. Both Jacob, who derived the descent from Solomon, and Eli, who derived his from Nathan. So this is taking into the first generation after David. One of them tells us it comes from Solomon, the other one tells us he comes from Nathan. First, how it is that these two, Jacob and Eli, were brothers. And then how it is that their fathers, Nathan and Melchi, also of different families, are declared to be grandfathers of Joseph. Different families, because one of them considers the line of Joseph as coming from Solomon, the son of David. The other genealogy traces it back to Nathan, also son of David. But it comes down telling us also that even Nathan goes into this intricacy of levirate versus natural marriage. Nathan and Melchi having married in succession the same woman because of levirate marriage. Oh, keep this in mind. Levirate marriage didn't just stop in siblings. We go back to another thing. Let's say um, let's say that, for example, that I would have died without having a kid. Of course, thank God I have 4 children. But let's say that was not the case. And I would have died without children. But my 3 brothers are all already married. Since my 3 brothers are all already married, none of them can marry my widow. So then levirate marriage goes to the next of kin, and this time it would have to be one of my cousins. If none of them can, it goes to my next of kin, my cousin's second degree. If none of them can, it goes to my cousin's third degree. If none of them can, cousins of fourth degree, and on and on and on until they find somebody who's next of kin who can marry the widow and thus produce a child for the deceased. Joseph, therefore, we see that, for example, in the story of Ruth. Uh, if you've ever read the book of Ruth, we find out that Ruth has two sons, and both sons died childless. So Ruth, Naomi, excuse me, Naomi is the one who has like two kids, the two children who died childless. So the widow of one of those two offsprings of Naomi, her name, the widow's name is Ruth. She ends up marrying um, her husband's cousin Boaz, who's the one who gives birth to King David's father, Isai. Let's continue. Joseph, therefore, being the object proposed to us, it must be shown how it is that it is recorded to be his father, both Jacob, who derived, we just read that, right? Paragraph 7. Nathan and Melchi, having married in succession the same woman, we just read that, we begot children who were uterine brothers. So both Nathan and Melchi um, had children in the womb. And for the law did not prohibit a widow, whether such by divorce or by death of her husband, from marrying another. Esther, then, for this was the woman's name according to tradition. It's not in scripture, but apostolic tradition and Jewish tradition tells us that Esther was one of these widows. For then, by Esther, then Nathan, a descendant of Solomon, first begot Jacob. And when Nathan was dead, Nathan died, and then Esther was a widow. Melchi, who traced his descent back to Nathan, so okay, Melchi was the cousin. Nathan was Nathan's cousin. And they both traced their line back to King David. One of them through Prince Solomon, the other one through Prince Nathan. So Nathan and Melchi. Okay, let's read. When Nathan was dead, Melchi, who traced his descent back to Nathan, Melchi was Nathan's cousin, being the same of tribe but of another family, because I was a cousin. Melchi, okay, it turns out that Nathan's brothers could not marry the Nathan's widow because they were all married. So then Melchi had to step in and marry his cousin's widow. And from there comes Eli. Thus we find the two, Jacob and Eli, also belonging to different families, yet brethren by the same mother, because of levirate marriage. One of these, Jacob, when his brother, through levirate marriage, Eli, had died childless, took the latter's wife and begot by her a son Joseph, his own son by nature, and in accordance with reason, wherefore also it is written, Jacob begot Matthew. So according to reason, according to real marriage, Joseph's father was Eli. But Eli had married a widow. Eli had married her cousin's widow who had died childless. So Eli had to marry the widow to give birth a son, and the first child, according to levirate marriage, was to be considered the son of the dead person. In this case, the first son that Eli had with Esther was to be considered as Jacob's son. For Jacob, being the brother of the latter, raised up seed to him. Hence, the genealogy traced through him will not be rendered void, which the evangelist Matthew in his enumeration gives thus: Jacob begot Joseph, because Matthew is telling us the genealogy according to levirate marriage. But Luke, on the other hand, Luke, not being a Jew, did not follow the concept of levirate marriage, so he gives us the natural genealogy. Who was the son, as was supposed for this, he also adds, of Joseph, the son of Eli, the son of Melchi, for he could not more clearly express the generation according to law. And the expression he begot, he has omitted in his genealogical table up to the end, tracing the genealogy back to Adam and the Son of God. Matthew's genealogy being based on levirate marriage, which was part of the law of Moses, only traces it as far back as Moses. And actually to Jacob, actually. Because before Jacob, there was no levirate marriage. But Luke, being the Gentile, traces it to natural genealogy, so he takes it all the way back to Jesus Christ. Now, his as was supposed for this he also adds of Joseph, the son of Eli, the son of Melchi, for he could not more clearly express the generation according to the law. In other words, Luke, who tells us the generation, he cannot go based on levirate marriage because Luke was not a Jew, so he cannot tell us that it was what the levirate marriage was. Luke did not practice levirate marriage. Luke's culture did not practice levirate marriage. Matthew's culture did. And the expression he begot, he has omitted in his genealogy, the table up to the entrance of the genealogy. Okay, now since Luke bases it on natural marriage instead of levirate marriage, he can trace it back to Adam himself. For the relatives of the Lord, according to the flesh, that is, those of natural marriage, whether with a desire of boasting or simply wishing to state a fact, in either case, truly have handed down the following account. Now we see that Eusebius digresses a little. Now Eusebius goes and starts telling us a bit of the political events taking about place in the time and applying it to the time of Jesus' birth, the politics that of the time. I've headed down the following account. Some Idumean robbers, this is referring to the house of King Herod, who were really desert bandits who befriended the Romans and thus were able to rise to becoming kings of Jerusalem strictly because of the support of the Romans, as we are to see. Having attacked Ascalon, a city of Palestine, carried away from the temple of Apollo, which stood near the walls, in addition to other booty, Antipater. Antipater was an Idumean at the service of Apollo in Ashkelon. This Antipater is the father of Herod, of King Herod. The son of a certain temple slave named Herod. And this is not the same Herod we know of the Bible. There was Herod, the father of Antipater, the father of Herod. So King Herod's grandfather was also called Herod. And since the priest was not able to pay the ransom for his son, Antipater was brought up in the custom of the Idumeans, and afterwards befriended Hyrcanus, the high priest of the Jews. If you see how it's all connected, the genealogies of Jesus Christ connect to the situation between Hyrcanus and Herod and Antipater, which connects to what we've read about Josephus. We read this actually the week before before my pause. You remember that Hyrcanus was fighting his brother Aristobulus over the throne of Jerusalem. And then now we find out that Antipater befriends who does it befriends Hyrcanus. And having been sent by Hyrcanus on an embassy to Pompeii, you will remember that we've read that while Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, both children of Alexander Jannaeus, they're fighting over the throne, but now Rome has taken over that territory. So now the king, the Roman emperor, has to decide whether Hyrcanus or Aristobulus becomes king. And that emperor decides against Aristobulus and to give the power to Hyrcanus, but he does not name him king, just names him high priest, and that's it. Because the Roman emperor preferred Antipater's family to rule Jerusalem. And after having been sent by Hyrcanus, so Hyrcanus sends Antipater to Rome to speak for him, but then is betrayed by Antipater because because the king decides in favor of Antipater instead of Hyrcanus, who sent Antipater in the first place. And having restored to him the kingdom which had been invaded by his brother Aristobulus, he had the good fortune to be named procurator of Palestine. This is Antipater. Antipater gets named to be procurator of Palestine. In other words, it is Antipater's job to make sure that Hyrcanus does Emperor Augustus's bidding. And notice, it's telling us Palestine here, and you've heard me repeatedly tell you that Palestine is not the correct term, but we need to keep in mind when Eusebius is writing. Eusebius of Caesarea is writing this around the end of the 3rd century, beginning of the 4th century. During this time, actually, it is the beginning because the word Palestine was invented by Emperor Hadrian in the year 135, and it was used up until the time when Constantine conquers the land in 314 and gives it back its original name of Israel. So we know this one was written between 277 after the time of Emperor Hadrian, but before 314, the time of Constantine. So when he writes this, when he writes this specific volume, the church was still being persecuted. Remember, this work, Church History, involves 10 volumes, 10 different books, part 1 through part 10. We are reading the first part, so it's the very beginning. And by the time he gets to the 10th volume, things have significantly changed. The church was being still persecuted when he writes the first volume, but has been liberated by the time he gets to the 10th volume. Antipater, having been slain by those who were envious of his great fortune, was succeeded by his son Herod, who was afterwards, by decree of the Senate, the Roman Senate, made king of the Jews under Antony and Augustus, Emperor Augustus. His sons were Herod and the other tetrarchs. These account also great with those of the Greeks. In other words, paragraph 12, Eusebius of Caesarea digressed. He veered off the topic, telling us about what's going on with the politics and how Herod is named to become king of Jerusalem, named so by the Romans. And then he puts Antipater in charge of making sure that these people do what the emperor of Rome, Augustus, tells them to. So Antipater gets assassinated, and his son Herod and gets elevated to the throne. And then Herod has another child, also called Herod, afterwards. Both of these mentioned a lot in the Gospels. But as there had been kept the archives up to the time the genealogies of the Hebrews, as well as those who trace their lineage back to proselytes such as Achior the Ammonite and Ruth the Moabitess, excuse me, and those who were mingled with the Israelite and came out of Egypt with them, Herod, inasmuch as the lineage of the Israelites, contributed nothing to his advantage. In other words, it was customary for the Jews to keep a very careful record of their family trees. But since Herod was not king, was not actually a Jew, he was forced to become a Jew. Herod was actually Antipater, was actually an Idumean. Remember, Antipater's father was in the service of the pagan god Apollo because they were not Jews. But when the Maccabee kings rose to power, Herod's family was forced to convert to Judaism. But since they were not Jews, they could not trace their family line to um, to King David. This put them at a disadvantage because he was a descendant from David who had to be king of Jerusalem, not a pagan by birth, not a Gentile forced into Judaism by like Herod's family. So since Herod had no way of proving that he was a descendant of David because he was not, he burned his actual genealogy and tried to burn some of the records of the genealogies that existed. But he failed. Let's continue. Um, Herod, inasmuch as the lineage of the Israelites contributed nothing to his advantage because he was not a descendant of David, and since he was goaded but with the consciousness of his own ignoble extraction, being that he was a pagan turned converted to Judaism, burned all the genealogical records, thinking that he might appear of noble origin if no one else were able, from the public registers, to trace back his lineage to the patriarchs or the proselytes, and to those mingled with them who were called Geore. Geore were those who were um, not Jewish people, but married into Judaism. For example, Ruth, whom we already spoke about, was a Moabite. She was not a Jew, but she married Boaz, a Jew, and and through that marriage, um, she is considered now a Jew because even though she was born into a Gentile family, by marrying a Jew, now you're under the Jews' coverage according to that society that they had. In that society, the woman was counted under her husband, not under herself. So if you were if you were a Gentile, but your husband, if you were born to a Gentile family, but your husband is a Jew, you are considered a Jew. But if you're born to the Jewish family and you marry a Gentile, the Jewish society would consider you a Gentile, not a Jewess, even though you were born into the Jewish family. The Geore were the offspring of these people like Ruth, Rahab, who were not Jewish women, but they ended up marrying Jewish men, and thus they were considered to be Jewish through their marriage. These offerings were called the Geore. A few of the careful, however, having obtained private records of their own, those who went through the due diligence of researching their family trees before Herod burned these records, either by remembering the names or by getting them in some other way from the registered, pride themselves in preserving the memory of their noble extraction. Among these are those already mentioned, called the Desposini, on account of the connections with the family of the Savior. The Deposini are the people who are one way or another genealogically connected to Jesus Christ, such as the Apostle um, Thaddeus, who happens to be the cousin of Jesus Christ. Coming from Nazareth and Kohaba, villages of Judea, into the other parts of the world, they drew the aforesaid genealogy from memory and from the book of daily records as faithfully as possible. Whether then the case stand thus or not, no one could find a clear explanation. According to my own opinion, that is Eusebius speaking, and that of every candid person, and let him this suffice us. For although we can urge no testimony in its support, we have nothing better or truer to offer. In other words, he is telling us that he is going based on what apostolic tradition tells us of the differences between levirate and natural marriage. And let's see. In any case, the gospel states the truth. Neither Luke or Matthew can be questioned. And at the end of the same episode, he adds these words: Nathan, who was descended from Solomon, begot Jacob. And when Nathan was dead, Melchi, who was descended from Nathan, begot Eli by the same woman. Eli and Jacob were thus uterine brothers. They were both children of the same mother. Eli having died, and notice that it mentions uterine brothers. ¿Qué pasó? Padre, Hijo, Espíritu Santo. Estoy viendo mi video, hija. Ya te acabo de dar la bendición. Okay, so because in Jewish custom, the word brothers also refers to any type of relative. So when we hear the Bible telling us the brothers of Jesus, it does not mean that they were children of Mary, because these other so-called brothers of Jesus are not uterine siblings. So in Hebrew tradition, we need to specify whether they were uterine brothers or just related. Eli having died childless, Jacob raised up seed to him, begetting Joseph, his own son by nature, but by law the son of Eli. Thus Joseph was the son of both. Thus, in other words, he is explaining the same thing I explained to you about a person gets married but dies before the wife can get pregnant. So now that widow has to marry the next of kin and get pregnant by him. And that first pregnancy is considered by the levirate marriage law to be considered pregnancy by the deceased. Um, Thus, for Afrikaners, okay, therefore, both genealogies are correct, but one is telling us the genealogy based on natural marriage. Who is the actual person who got the woman pregnant? The other one goes by levirate marriage. Who is a child actually being credited to, regardless of who got her pregnant? Thus, for Afrikaners and the lineage of Joseph being thus traced, Mary also is virtually shown to be the same tribe with him, since according to the law of Moses, intermarriage between different tribes were not permitted, for the command is to marry one of the same family and lineage, so that there inheritance may not pass from tribe to tribe. This may suffice here. In other words, according to the law of Moses, and we see this when Joshua distributed the lands. Remember, Moses dies before going into the promised land, and Joshua takes over. Once Joshua leads the Israelites to conquer the promised land, he distributes the land amongst the tribes, amongst the 12 tribes. But some people rose to be concerned because women themselves did not have a right to unto themselves. So let's say, okay, the people of these Israelites got a very serious worry that they had. Let's say I'm of the tribe, for example, of Dan. If I were to marry someone who belongs, say, to the tribe of Asher, that that land would not belong to Asher anymore. It would have to belong to the tribe of Dan, and thus my tribe has taken over another tribe's piece of land, and thus some tribes would be losing their land because of the women marrying into those other tribes. So, in order to avoid this problem and ensure that the land stays within the tribe's um, estate, not only were Israelites forbidden from marrying the pagans, they were forbidden from marrying people from another tribe. If you were tribe of Dan, you had to marry only people of Dan. If you were of the tribe of Judah, you were only allowed to marry people from Judah. If you were from the tribe of Benjamin, you were only allowed to marry into the tribe of Benjamin. This would ensure that each tribe would continue holding on to their land, and it would also ensure that this land would not fall back to the hands of Gentiles, of the Canaanites, whom they had conquered. So thus we end here, and like always, long live Christ the King!